Welcome back to another episode of the Daily Flip podcast. I'm your host, Alex, and today we're going to be flipping through some of the top stories, including the closing or potential closing of Google's antitrust case about their advertising business, how the rural voters may be in for a little bit more than they bargained for with some of the Trump tariff possibilities, and our final article talking about how Texas is probably going to ban mifepristone and actually classify it as a more restricted drug. And of course, we will end today with our daily delight, a story meant to leave you feeling positive, ready to take on the day. But that's enough rambling for me. Let's jump into our daily debate. So, does Google have too much control over the advertising space? For someone who is not initiated, you may not have an answer. Maybe you have a little gut feeling about how much control Google has over various markets, but you probably don't have all of the details. And I would honestly say we probably, even as the public, don't have all of the information solely because they're going to keep a lot of it behind closed doors. Some of it's proprietary information that they are going to make sure does not get out to the public, so they can guarantee that they're able to best use all the various or copious amounts of information that they take from us. But give it a little gut check. Put it in the comment section. I'd love to hear what everybody has to say. Enough of me ranting on that. Let's actually get into the article that comes from AP. Judge hears closing arguments on whether Google's advertising tech constitutes a monopoly. So, when Lina Khan was first going after, the Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples of the world, a lot of people were very skeptical because these companies have avoided the yoke of government antitrust prosecution for quite some time. But this time, it has not gone Google's way. At least I believe when I was reading through this, the government at least has a strong argument. Do I agree with that argument? Do I think that it's actually a sound way to look at the situation? Not necessarily, and I'll break down that part of the opinion when we get there. But that doesn't mean they don't have a strong argument that could compel many people, especially some judges. So let's get up to the second paragraph and actually read a little quote here. Quote, "The Justice Department and Google made closing arguments Monday in a trial alleging Google's advertising technology constitutes an illegal monopoly. U.S. District Judge Leon Brinkema in Alexandria, Virginia, will decide the case and is expected to issue a written ruling by the end of the year. If Brinkema finds Google has engaged in illegal monopolistic conduct, she will then hold further hearings to explore the remedies that should be imposed," end quote. And that is always a fun part about, then again, it's always a fun part of any trial, which is they split it up after everybody presents their arguments, and then they actually have the sentencing afterwards, and then they have it's not always like this, but in antitrust cases, the stages are very, very fun because it's not as simple as saying, okay, here is the crime you committed and here is the penalty for that crime under law. Because while it says that they can't have an illegal monopoly, very often a judge can have a little bit of leeway as to what they do. Are they going to break up the different parts of the technology into different companies? Are they going to restrict it in other ways? There's different remedies that the judge can take afterwards, which is always what's interesting about antitrust cases, because sometimes you get them split into multiple oil companies like Standard Oil before in the in the early 1900s, and then sometimes you get Microsoft and the restrictions that were put on them in the 80s, 90s. So the point being that it's going to be a very interesting one if this comes out in favor of the government rather than Google. But we actually have to get through what the arguments are first and see what the validity to both sides' arguments and claims are. So let's go through this first part of the more in-depth section of the article. Quote, "During 3 hours of arguments Monday, Brinkema, who sometimes tips her hand during legal arguments, did little to indicate how she might rule. She did, though, question the applicability of a key antitrust case Google cites in its defense. The Justice Department contends Google built and maintained a monopoly on open web display advertising, essentially the rectangular ads that appear on the top and right-hand side of the page when one browses websites. In between is another Google product, Ad Exchange, that conducts nearly instantaneous auctions matching advertisers to publishers, end quote. So you can see that they have a very well-oiled machine here. Not only are they able to very ingeniously track every single piece of information about you, or at least a large chunk of it, but they're also able to sell off the ads on these different websites almost immediately to sellers, or technically buyers for this, but people who are actually trying to sell their products, and therefore they're paying for advertisement. And you can basically create a portfolio. You can say, hey, as a seller, if I'm selling beige hats, I want to probably appeal to people that are a little bit older. I want to appeal to people who wear hats, maybe people that are bold. And if you have any of these other factors, because remember, Google is the largest search engine ever. So maybe it holds on to some of your search results from a year ago, or it has some cookies from a website you visited when you were looking into how to fix baldness or how to combat balding. And then also the fact that you started looking for baseball caps after that. And it builds enough of a profile that they can say on the advertiser side, the person who's actually buying that advertising slot, they can say, okay, hey, I want a general profile here of people that are going to buy the beige hat, and either they can pay for their own research in order to figure out what those people are going to look for, or they can even go to Google and basically tell them with their ad service to say, I need this profile, build out a custom, or I need these type of customers, build out a custom profile that will say any ads that fall within this demographic, we want to be able to buy those advertising slots up. And then they basically, every single time you click on something, there are thousands upon probably millions of these transactions a minute where they're instantaneously having a price set and sold to people that want to advertise on these different websites, and they're trying to match them best to you. So the more information Google has on you, the more they are able to sell to you, and the more honed in the information that the company who is selling is able to provide them, they can build basically a portfolio that is going to give them the most returns. They can say, hey, single moms probably aren't going to wear this hat as much, so we don't want to sell this hat to them. Or we know that, teenagers, they're going to want new toys. They're not going to want hats, so don't sell to them. And we want to make sure it doesn't show up on their feed. So they're trying to save money this way, and they're trying to optimize and make their process of selling the most efficient possible. But the point that we're getting at here is that is a lot of control that Google has. And the fact that a lot of the internet's ad buy system or ad system is built around this sort of model, and a lot of it flows through Google, considering Google is one of the largest search engines in the entire world, it does lend itself to a question of whether or not that is too much control. Then again, remember, when you're using Google Chrome and Google Search, that's a little bit different than when you're on specific websites like Meta, when you're on websites like Instagram. Snapchat is now doing apparently customized response or customized ads that go directly to you. It's very fascinating. But Google would contend that all these different spaces where they don't necessarily control, they can control the web traffic, not control the web traffic, they can monitor and use the web traffic that goes through their own servers in order to actually get information. But once you go onto some of these websites, it's actually kind of closed off. Just because something's being hosted on Chrome, or at least because you're logging into Meta through Chrome, that doesn't necessarily mean Chrome has all that information. And they definitely don't get the money for ads sold on there, because Meta has their own ad selling software and system that is able to reap benefits for them. And obviously they don't want to give up a chunk of their money to Google if they don't have to, maybe for advertising, but otherwise probably not. So that would be Google's contention. Google's contention would say there are so many other places where ads are sold. If a company wants to buy ads, they don't just have to buy on the internet in Google. They can buy on Instagram. They can go buy on X for all they care. They could go buy on TV. They could buy on radio. There are so many places in which people can buy ads and they can sell their product. And that is a pretty strong argument, in my opinion, which is the internet does not have to be used in order. And also, let's be clear, there are other browsers now that don't necessarily sell your data and they don't necessarily have ads just pop up. And websites can do their own third party ad sales that have nothing to do with the highly tracked metrics that Google has. So the point I'm getting at is there are a lot of different markets where ads are sold, even on the internet. Even if you want to go on the internet, Google has a lion's share of the internet traffic and therefore the most information, and therefore they can most customize the ads and take advantage of that. Fair enough. But there are plenty of other options out there. And if there is a conscious consumer who doesn't necessarily want to be sold to in that way, or even conscious sellers, they can go do things on third-party sites. They can go partner with other places. Like they could literally form a conglomerate of advertisers and go to different search engines and say, hey, we want to try to give you a little bit of extra funding so you can build out your own ad network. So my point being that in the broader scale of advertising, this is a drop in the bucket. They're estimating that it'd be about like 10% of total ads, and more or less. Obviously that is a very vague number because what do you count as an ad? Is a billboard an ad? So on and so forth. But they're saying about 10% of the overall advertising market that consumers deal with on a daily basis from anything that basically comes across a piece of bandwidth or over the internet, essentially, because TV is not over the internet anymore, it's on cable. But you get the point I'm getting at, because I described the various different sectors that they would consider a part of the same game that they're playing with advertising. And then the government's coming in and saying, no, we are looking at search engines specifically. And that is normally how an antitrust case is fought. It is normally, and let's be clear, sometimes the companies make arguments about comparative advantages or disadvantages to the consumer, especially when the Department of Justice is taking on like merger cases. They'll very often say, well, actually, if these two companies merge, though the market share will be increased, it will actually be able to streamline some of the processes and be able to get more economies of scale and therefore cheapen things for consumers. But in this case, when they're taking on an antitrust monopoly case, the argument is normally going to be, what is the scope of the market? What are we actually looking at? That is the first thing that you have to do. You have to define what the market actually is. Because if you're defining it one way, you can get a number like the DOJ is getting, which is they have 90% of online advertising sales. They control about 90% of where ads are placed and where they go, anywhere on the internet. That's the number that the DOJ is coming up with. It's a little bit of an oversimplification of their argument, but that's the point. And then Google is making the argument, no. The advertising game is so much larger than this, and we're only 10% of the entire game. That is not a huge market share. We can't bully people around on this broader scale. Maybe we can do it in our own little clique, but even then, we've built out the infrastructure and people like it. So that is always the first hurdle when you're going into antitrust cases. And if you study economics, you'll hear plenty about it. I promise you, if you take a government and economics course, you will do plenty of case studies talking about it. One of the famous ones that we handled in class was Dr. Pepper and Coca-Cola. And they were trying to merge, and basically it would be like number 1 and number 4 kind of doing a merger. And I thought, while I did in the class actually argue for the position of the government, I basically agreed with the prosecutors. That was simply because I thought it was an argument that was cohesive and it was easy to explain, but I also didn't necessarily agree. And, well, I take that back. At the time, I did agree for the most part. Like, I was leaning probably 51-49 is what I would say, honestly. And I thought that, I can make a compelling argument for either one, but I thought that the argument from the prosecution was very well laid out, and I felt like they had more research on hand in order to actually prove my point, and I was able to argue it. But looking back on it, the idea was Coca-Cola and Dr. Pepper, because they were doing a merger, so it's a little bit different. But they were basically claiming that if they were to merge, they're not actually, the top number 1 and number 4 in the soda business. What you really need to think about it is as a beverage business. And even you could even say like a caffeinated beverage business, which is, we have to go up against, teas with caffeine in it. We have to go up against companies that are producing coffee. We have to go up against sweet tea producers. We have to go up against bottled water people. And they didn't say bottled water people, but it is implied in their argument there. And it would actually show that their market share is much smaller when you do that. And I actually think that argument is fair, because one of the arguments I made in my first sentence was, well, would you replace your morning coffee with a soda? Or would you replace your afternoon soda with a coffee? Because if they are truly interchangeable, then I think you could make an argument that the market is not just for caffeinated soda, but rather it is caffeinated beverages, or it's even beverages in general. And when I was younger at that point, I would say, no, I would never do that. Now that I'm a little bit older, I'd be like, yeah, I mean, caffeine is caffeine. So it's very interesting how life gives you some of those different perspectives. And I would say if I had looked at this a few years ago, when I was really, really reading into how Google has bought up so many companies and basically killed them in the cradle or integrated their technology into their own company rather than having to face it, and also to eliminate potential threats to their ad service, which is the idea that their services can be absolutely free, but they are actually financed by the ads that are being sold to you. And there have been companies that could possibly disrupt that long term. They have bought them and killed them in the cradle in order to ensure that this system that basically the entire internet runs on at this point is not disturbed. And if you had given me this case back then, when I was reading through it and I was really trying to understand why Google was so powerful and what would come after Google, I would have definitely said, oh yeah, hey, come after them. And I'm not necessarily against it too much now. I in theory, I like the power of Google being checked, but that doesn't mean that I want it to necessarily be in a way where they're actually stripping them of fundamental processes. What I would like to see is maybe a crackdown on mergers in the future when they're doing it for malintent, because we know that they have done it for malintent in the past, which is to basically pick up a company and make sure that they're not a competitor going forward. That is them purposely purchasing a company and then killing the technology, which is doing it in bad faith. And I think maybe you can make an argument on a social level that we need to start using alternatives. I mean, the main browser that I use throughout the course of my day is Brave rather than anything else. Then again, for some other things, I use DuckDuckGo, and for more than one thing particularly, but really for one process, I use the normal Google Chrome because it operates faster. And on the other ones, I don't necessarily need it to be faster. I just want it to be more private. So we as a society can step up in order to make sure that Google doesn't have this unlimited control over or as much access to the information as they do currently, in order to because that would actually make their ad service system less effective, and therefore it would actually force them to shift the way they do things, because the economic incentive wouldn't be there because they can't make as in-depth profiles about their users. So I think while the DOJ is pursuing this for righteous means, in my opinion, I would also say that we can implement some of these changes ourselves. And that doesn't mean that Google doesn't need to be checked. It doesn't mean that Google has biases that they're going to let flow, but every company has biases. And I can't necessarily say I want to restrict them just because they have biases, because then that is the weaponization of government. So I've thought long and hard about this one. I'm still going back and forth. I may have a different opinion in the future, but I still believe it is up to us as consumers to truly push back against these companies, because that is the beauty of our system. And putting more regulations and more restrictions in place from the government is actually allowing a reasoning and a precedent for more government interference in the future. And I'd rather not have that. But also, like I said, Google's ad technology is extremely effective, and it's not something to be laughed at. It's not something to be scoffed at. We actually have to take it seriously and understand how they're selling us, what they're selling us, and how they're exploiting our weaknesses in order to do so. So with that said, let's jump into our second article that talks about President-elect Donald Trump, and how, actually, I'll just read the headline, obviously, from Daily Cost. Quote, Trump's supporters in rural areas are in for a nasty surprise. And yeah, no. I think this is true for the most part. So there has been some ruminations. There has been some talking points really recently about, oh, well, Trump isn't actually doing this tariff policy because he's not saying he's going to do the tariff policy because he wants to do the tariff policy. He's really doing it so that he'll have leverage and he'll be able to negotiate and he'll be able to come to the table and say, well, if you don't do what I want you to do, then the 10%, the 20% tariff, the flat tariff, we're going to do it. I don't care what you say. Nope. Listen to me. Nope, Mattis, listen to me. I just picture him there trying to bully him with it. And they're trying to make the argument that no, he's going to use it as a lever in order to get what he wants. And while that's fair enough, that is very, very fair. And I understand that taking Trump too literally at his word is always a bad thing because he is hyperbolic sometimes. But he also has a track record of implementing tariffs when he feels like we are at a trade disadvantage. And he is also basically implying that we need to bring American jobs back. And if we can do it with China, and he believed it was effective a policy during his time, and he believes the rest of the world is also gypping us, I don't see the lack of rationale there to see a rationalization on his part. So I'm making a few assumptions, but Trump has a history that he's actually implemented some of these policies, and he said he's wanted to implement the policies last time, and then he implemented it. And this time he says he wants to implement it. I think there's a likelihood that he'll implement it. He's not just using it as a lever in order to negotiate, but also you could argue that he saw some benefits from what he did last time and therefore could justify doing the tariffs again. And also there are other people who are actually genuinely protectionist economists, or at least lean that way within his administration. JD Vance being one of them that is not afraid. Now, does he fully endorse a 20% tariff? No, but is not afraid to actually use the levers of the US government in order to reach their political ends, even from a trade perspective. And that scares me a little bit because this article, whether or not I don't like how snarky they're being about it, but they're not necessarily wrong. And there's also another aspect of the policy agenda that they try to criticize. Let's just go to the second paragraph. Quote, now it's the farmers who are sounding the alarm about Trump's plan to carry out his promises to jack up tariffs and deport 10 to 15 million immigrants. Apparently, they thought Trump was bloviating and didn't really mean to carry out his promises, which because like I said, they're being a little bit snarky here. It's not unreasonable to say that he promised something and he didn't deliver. He wasn't able to get all of the wall that he wanted. He didn't actually get Hillary Clinton out of there and try to prosecute her. Like he said, will you be in jail? We're going to prosecute Hillary. We're going to lock her up. Like, come on. He didn't actually go through with a lot of that. A lot of the tariffs with China, while they were effective, and they weren't exactly what he had promised beforehand. He wasn't able to onshore as many jobs as he had promised before. So he does bloviate. He does say lots of weird stuff and doesn't always follow through with it. That doesn't mean that every single time he's not going to follow through with things, but you can at least agree that you can't take him at literally everything he says is a literal. Like the bloodbath comments, come on. Is that really literal? He was talking economically. And if you don't agree with me, go back and listen to the entire clip. Please go back and listen to the entire clip. Because I'll tell you now, you can tell just by listening and even watching him, you can definitely tell. But by just listening, you can tell that was supposed to be a strung together sentence that was on the same topic, which was talking about exporting auto manufacturing jobs to Mexico, and it will be an economic bloodbath. But hey, okay, whatever. My point being that he talks big a lot, so it makes sense that people would think he's bloviating. But I believed him on this one. I'll be honest. I believed him on this one. And maybe it's because it's a policy that I wouldn't even want to take the chance that he is possibly going to do it when it comes to the tariffs. Maybe I was sitting there like, even if I don't even want the possibility. I have to know he's joking, or I have to know that he's doing it, and that's going to determine what's happening. And if I don't know if he's not doing it, then I'm going to lean on the side that there's a possibility that he will do it, because he's at least entertained the idea and gone out and put it on a stump speech. And I don't like that whatsoever. But hey, let me keep going with the quote here. Quote, "That's a common talking point on the right these days. I thought Trump meant what he said. Rural America has been the foundation of the MAGA Republican support. In 2024, Trump won rural voters by an overwhelming margin of 64-32 over Harris. Moreover, Trump won over 77% of the popular vote on average in the nation's most farming-dependent counties." Here's the part that's very specific, very interesting. Trump's loyal supporters in the nation's Farm Belt are justifiably worried that Trump is going to badly damage their $1.5 trillion industry, with the risk of losing workers and business. Agricultural output will decline between $30 to $60 billion if Trump's signature deportation policy is carried out. Not to mention the possible increases in trade costs, which could actually harm them. Then again, we already subsidize the agricultural industry to a massive degree. So I'm gonna be very honest with you. We may just decide to not hurt them. We may decide to help them more and just give them more subsidies. It's going to be interesting. But yes, I do agree that there is a genuine sentiment that is bubbling up on the right, and commentators who are all in on Trump have come out and they've tried to defend the policies. And I'm not saying that it's wrong to try to defend the policies. If you agree with the policies, defend it. But the people who are really loyal, they're like, oh, well, that's not actually what he's going to do. It's actually not going to have this effect. And I'm sitting there saying, no, I think that you're just pulling the line here because you don't want there to be genuine discouragement at what he could possibly do. And this is something that you should have considered. Not to say that it should have stopped you from voting, because maybe it wouldn't have. I don't know. If you care about it that much, maybe it would have. But the point being that this is not something that should be taken lightly, and it can't be thrown away. You voted Trump in. Now you have to deal with it. Even I agree that you're scared about it. Fair enough. Your livelihoods may be hurt by it. Hopefully, the quote-unquote rising tide idea of Trump lowering taxes, trying to balance the budget, maybe that's enough to actually lift you up over time, and you're going to feel short-term pain, long-term gain, but who knows? And it's going to be an interesting next few years, because there's definitely some things. His policies go back between populist, protectionist, free market, especially some of his appointees. So I can't say anything. But that is an interesting piece that goes deeper into how farmers are going to possibly be hurt by this. And like I said, it's snarky, but at least give it a chance to actually read some of the data that it provides. All right, so our last article comes from Raw Story, and it talks about how the new Texas bill that is being brought forward will actually make mifepristone, or any variation of it, a restricted substance. So it's not that it's actually going to be all out banned, because there are legitimate medical uses for it, or at least that's what people who like mifepristone, that's what they argue, that it can be used to, and let's be clear, I'm not saying it can't be used for this, but it can be used to clear the uterus after possible miscarriages or things like this. So there's the possibility of it having a legitimate medical use, but very often, and currently after Roe v. Wade got overturned, it has primarily been used in order to actually cause abortions in the first place. So the point that they're getting at here is that this Texas bill actually has its roots in Louisiana. It's actually very fascinating. I'm not going to go into it as much as I wanted, because I did run over on some of the other segments, and either we will return to this in the future, or I think the better way to go about it is you should go and read it, because it is absolutely fascinating. This comes from the left's perspective, and though they are hypercritical of the what they see as a moral outrage of restricting people's right to abortion, they still lay it out in such a way that I find it kind of admirable that they're giving such air to the other side of the story, even though it's sparse. At least it's not totally overwhelmingly just left wing. They could just make a story saying this new bill is bad, but no, they actually try to develop the history. They try to tell you about what happened in Louisiana. They try to talk to you about the other doctors who have been affected by this. They've also talked about how the state's trying to make it so that it can still be it can still be in a crash cart, but it could also be in a restricted area. So you have to put in a code. You can't just have random people grabbing it. You can't just give it to any patient. It has to be accessed especially, which should, in theory, and make it, even though they're making it slower to actually be able to use mifepristone in emergency situations, which is rare, but still, where anybody could just go get it and it could be on a crash cart and they could just give it to a patient, because now it'll have to be in a secure facility or stored somewhere in a closet that's locked down, or maybe behind the pharmaceutical counter at a hospital. They're still trying to have other solutions that allow it to be there, but it'll be in like a locked cabinet on the crash cart. And I don't think the left would normally give people this much credit, or at least people on this side who believe that abortion is something that should be totally legal. I don't think they would give as much background story, extra details, unless they were giving it a genuine attempt. And this article was written in semi-good faith. Semi-good faith. I say semi-good faith because there are just general misconceptions about abortion and the rate at which and some of these medical procedures are actually done in here. No doubt about that. But I would say go read that article for yourself. It's an interesting one. It's really fascinating. And it will probably be, I think it took me, 10, 15 minutes this morning. With that said, let's jump into our daily delight. This one comes from the Miami Herald. Adorable way man wakes up deaf dogs from nap so they don't startle. So this guy, he has 3 deaf dogs who are actually basically his service dogs, and it's so adorable. It is honestly so adorable. Go watch it. If you haven't had your heart warmed today, this will be it. Or maybe you just want to read it. Maybe reading it alone will do that to you. I know watching the video did that for me. And with that said, if you want to check out any of the other stories, like I recommended the Raw story, all the links for all of them will be in the description below that like and subscribe button. Also down there, you can find the podcast on Spotify, Pocket Cast, Podvine, as well as the Twitter handle, where on Tuesday I released a Twitter tirade. It's a little bit more bloviating. I've been doing some reposts recently because we're doing a little bit of a restructure on that side of things, and I'm trying to make it good before we move forward. And then also on Tuesday over here on the YouTube and the RSS feed is 6 in 6 stories from around the world in 6 minutes or less. So I was thinking about it, and this Friday I could do a full podcast ahead of time. I could just record it on Thursday, Thanksgiving, no big deal. But I kind of want to bring a episode of 6 in 6 to a Friday slot, just so people can experience it, because I'm not necessarily saying I'm the most proud of it, like, oh, it's the hardest work ever, but I do genuinely enjoy doing the show, and it is a little bit more legwork on reading some more articles, pulling 6 different stories, and actually having a script, because I have to be able to get through it very quickly, and I can't just bloviate for 30 minutes. It has to be done in 6 minutes. So I'm still thinking that over, but I'm pretty sure I will be bringing you that on Friday instead of a 60-minute episode, or sorry, 60-minute, excuse me, a 30-minute episode like this one. So with all that said, there is only one more thing to say. Stay safe, don't die.